It's a little bit after 8 o'clock, and as most of you know, we always try to be on time. So, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. With great pride and honor, I welcome you all here in Kasteel Wittenburg for an exceptional evening. Exceptional because we have Paul Krugman in our midst, a great person who I had on my wanted list for quite some time. Mr. Krugman is outspoken, influential, and very independent. All qualities that we at the John Adams Institute strive for. My name is Monique Knapen and I am the director of the John Adams Institute. This evening is also exceptional because Mace Pearson Private Wealth Management was so generous to team up with the John Adams Institute to make this event possible. Tonight's John Adams lecture is a Mace Pearson forum as well, so thank God for that. Tonight's evening was sold out before we even could send out our usual promotion material. Therefore, we gave priority to our donors to obtain tickets, and I must say, I think we have only John Adams members here tonight, so it's very special. Besides our relations, we welcome, of course, all the clients of Mace Pearson Private Wealth Management staff. And I think those people maybe don't know what we do, and I want to briefly say something about it. Like I said, we are independent. We are independent, I'm not only trying to be, but we are independent, a non-profit Dutch foundation with the mission to bring inspiring Americans to a large and general audience. We are not here to criticize or defend American policies or ways of life, but to make us all familiar with the intellectual debate and the trends in literature and arts in the United States. People like Joseph Stiglitz, Robert Kaplan, Jerry Bremer, Robert Kagan, John Irving, Jonathan Franzen, just to name a few, have been our guests. We have great guests lined up, and to give you only one name, we'll have in October former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright in our program. So, to know more about us, to sign up for upcoming lectures, or to become a sponsor, a donor, you can pick up a brochure if you walk out this beautiful castle. For tonight, my esteemed friend and former board member, Sweder van Wijnbergen, will introduce Mr. Krugman in detail. Mr. van Wijnbergen knows Mr. Krugman personally from his time at MIT in the US. Van Wijnbergen studied physics and econometry. It's a difficult word to and he worked amongst others as Director General at the Ministry of Economic Affairs. And during those days, he was outspoken as he is today. And you probably won't be surprised when I tell you that as a civil servant, he didn't lose his appetite for frank views. After Sweder left the ministry, he started his own company, and he teaches at the University of Amsterdam. And he also continues to be a public figure as an expert in domestic and foreign economic issues. I'm very proud we have you here. Before Sweder will take the floor, I would like to briefly say something of tonight's layout. There will be an introduction, as I said, by Professor van Wijnbergen, and then Professor Krugman will speak for about 25 minutes. Without intermission, the professors will debate on several global and American issues, and the debate will be guided by Mark Blazer. Mark is a regular guest of the Mace Pearson forums and a dear friend of the John Adams Institute. He is the person who helped me a great deal making this all possible, and I want to thank you for that, Mark. Mark will moderate the debate and will orchestrate the questions and remarks from you. You're very welcome to use there are microphones out there, and you can easily take part of the debate, but Mark will orchestrate that. I think we're going to close at around 9:30, 9:45, and for now, please switch off your mobiles. Enjoy the evening, and may I ask Sweder to take my place. Thank you.
Well, Paul, it must be good to hear that you're not just on the most wanted list of the Neoconservatives, but also on the most wanted list of more sort of gentle people. This one you probably can live with. It's sort of odd to introduce Paul Krugman. If you wouldn't know him, you wouldn't be here to begin with. so obviously you know exactly whom you are going to listen to. If there was one line to summarize Paul Krugman, is that he doesn't fit into a standard mold. Like Joe Stiglitz, who was mentioned before, it's the sort of economist who always somehow manages to grab hold of a feature of reality that everybody always ignores, but somehow totally changes the way you look at the issue he's discussing. It's always surprising. It's always sort of, once you've heard it, surprisingly convincing, but always unexpected. He will never accept common wisdom without scrutiny. He won't automatically reject it. He's not part of the loony left. First time I met Paul, I was sort of a graduate student coming from Holland, overawed by, well, sort of in the early, too long ago to actually seriously say how long ago it was. But I came from Holland, and professors were sort of people you made appointments with 3 weeks ahead, and you went there dressed up in 3-piece suits, and yes sir, no sir. My first visit to MIT, I think the first professor I met was actually not Paul, but was another Paul, was Paul Samuelson, who was sort of in shorts, had his shoes in the corner, 2 dogs in each corner in the 3 corners of his office, and said, "Who are you?" That's too difficult. Your name is Van. That is, well, when I went to MIT, sort of on that visit, I had a sinking feeling that I somehow didn't quite, sort of judge the place right, because I went, being Dutch, in my sort of dressed up with tie and suit and everything, and I saw cut-off jeans, sneakers, incredibly hot, and sort of I was increasingly out of place. United States is a different world. First time I met Paul, I was still the beginning graduate student. He was already a celebrated PhD student from MIT who'd gone to Yale, and I think you just came back to MIT after 2 or 3 years, sort of unusually quickly. And I ran into him in the corridor and asked him, well, what do you ask one of the big stars, and you were a little student? All right, what are you going to do here? What's your research agenda? What sort of good stuff can we expect from you? And he gave a very simple answer. It's going to wacko theory. It has to be weird. As long as it's weird, it's good. Anything that's sort of predictable was boring. And I think that has been characterizing his academic work. You will probably, well, I guess given we don't have largely a non-academic audience, but you will all know that Paul is one of the world's top academics in international economics. Maybe it actually is interesting to give you some indication of what he has been doing, because it really fits the story I've been telling you so far. He's always somehow sort of has never followed a trend, but has initiated many. He's sort of the first economist who wrote sort of in a non-journalistic way about economic crisis. His early 70s article about balance of payments crisis is still being quoted, and I think the explanation he gave of how and why fixed exchange regimes collapse sort of pre-told Latin America story of 10, 15 years later. He is long before it became fashionable written extensively about the dynamics of economic development, the role of innovation, of knowledge transfers, of human capital, how countries could get stuck. The market doesn't always deliver the goodies, and the poor do not always catch up, and sometimes there may be sort of a very unfavorable equilibria where Africa does not become the United States. He's written about trade in a world when the world is not perfect, when there is strategic behavior, monopoly power, all the things that sort of don't fit the simple models, but unfortunately do describe the real world, and come up with surprising solutions. I think it has occasionally made you uncomfortable because you criticize the establishment, you criticize the common views, but sometimes the common views are right, and sometimes the alternatives are actually not right, and your arguments may be abused by people who probably, have quite a different agenda than you have. He started a whole new area of thinking on economic geography, the importance of location, the importance of conglomeration. Instead of being abstract things in economy, things in his models, cities played a role. It mattered where you lived, it mattered the makeup of the place where you were. All unorthodox, new stuff. I think he has displayed the same qualities as a commentator, as an acerbic analyst of world events, as an influential advisor. Well, you've come to hear him, not to hear me. So I'll ask Paul to come up and tell us what he wants to say. I think he's going to tell us about the United States today, the role of politics and economic decision making, the strange things that are happening now. Are we seeing a world power gone wild? What can we expect in the future, given that sort of the common sense checks and balances seem to have disappeared? Paul, let me invite you up here for your speech.
I'm losing my microphone pack, which is the reason I'm suddenly clutching at myself here. It's coming off. Well, thank you, Sweder. I just learned something about Sweder reading this brochure. I didn't know you were a physicist by training. That explains those gratuitous equations in the early paper. No, Sweder wrote very good papers, but they tended to have about 50% more equations than I would have had. And I'm also fascinated by to learn about the things you've been doing since, which, of course, we don't hear about because our view about other countries is that unless they make for good TV, they don't exist. So that's the American point of view. Okay, well, I'm going to talk initially about economics, but really I want to talk about the state of the United States today. And it's largely a political discussion in the end, but a good place to start with is with economic policy. So let me talk about the economic policy issue du jour, the thing that's been the subject of debate and horse trading and negotiation and over the last few weeks, which is the latest tax cut. As you probably know, the Bush administration has pushed for another big tax cut, and with varying justifications. But we do have a troubled economy, more or less the same problems that all of the advanced world now faces of sluggish growth, rising unemployment, fears about deflation. We also have, and this is new, compared with at the time we passed our last tax cut 2 years ago, we had a budget surplus and expectations that would continue indefinitely. Now we have a huge budget deficit and projections that it will continue indefinitely. Nonetheless, basically the administration has won. It has gotten itself in the legislative process. There's a Senate bill, there's a House bill. They don't look very much like each other, but out of the merge will probably come something that will largely generate what the administration wants. And I could talk about the straight economics of the tax cut. And just to give you a brief, there is a case to be made for the tax cut. It's not a very strong case. It doesn't look like what most economists would have said was the answer to our current problems. What we seem to need is something that puts money into the economy now, that causes people to spend more. This is a tax cut very much in what's become the standard mode now. It's a long-term tax cut, so that it actually puts in relatively little money into the economy now, and we'll be putting a lot of money in 5 years from now, 10 years from now, which we don't know whether we'll need that then, but it seems a little odd. It is a tax cut that is heavily tilted towards very, very wealthy people. And to just give you a sense of that, the House version, the numbers have been done, about 27% of the House tax cut will go literally to people making more than $1 million a year. So which is about 0.1% of the population. So it's really we're not talking just about giving to the upper middle class. We're talking about tax cuts that are targeted on the actually seriously rich. All right, all of who are also the people least likely to spend in this slump. So from the point of view of normal economic policy considerations, this doesn't look like, it looks like the answer to some other problem, not the problem that we have. And if you were going to, you could make an argument that said, well, look, yes, but there are some other good things, cutting tax rates on the rich, increases incentives, people People will work harder, they'll take more risks. You could make, in effect, the kinds of arguments that Ronald Reagan made when pushing his tax cuts more than 20 years ago. The interesting thing, I think more important than the content of this policy, is that that's not the way the argument ran. If you look at the way the tax cut has been sold, if you look at the Republican Party campaign literature, which friends of mine receive and pass on to me, it takes this tax cut, which is, it is whatever else it is. It's clearly, by the numbers, it's clearly a tax cut that its direct benefits fall very heavily on a small number of very, very well-off people. The Republican Party campaign literature and the stump speeches by Bush and others portray it as a populist measure. We're giving money to you, the people. The standard line in the administration's description has been this tax cut gives 93 million taxpayers an average tax cut of $1,000 a year. Now, there are actually about 140 million taxpayers in the U.S., so we're actually missing, there's a large group of people who don't receive any. But also, that when you say 93 million people get an average tax cut of $1,000 a year, that's because a small fraction of those people get very, very large tax cuts. The median tax cut turns out to be about $250 a year. So it's literally true, but it's giving people the impression they're all going to get $1,000 checks in the mail, and in fact, it's nothing like that. This is not unusual now. I think just a few years ago, we would have regarded this as a very peculiar thing. You wouldn't have, if you could have disputes over economic policy, but you wouldn't go about misleading the public about the content of the policy. You wouldn't actually say, this is a tax cut for middle class and working families when it's really a tax cut that's primarily for higher income families. You would offer some other argument. You'd say there are reasons why it's good for you, the working family, to have lower taxes on people who are richer than you. Trickle down, supply side, something like that. But this is new. I might also point out that if you look at the actual content of the bills, the people are concerned about the deficit. We're now looking at a situation of really quite serious budget deficits in the U.S., which wouldn't be so worrisome except that, like everybody else, we have an aging population. And in the case of the U.S., it's a very, very sharp cliff. And in the year 2012, the baby boomers start to hit the Social Security and Medicare systems. So abruptly, the budget takes a sharp turn for the worse now 9 years from the present. So in the legislative negotiations, senators insisted upon a limit, actually in both houses, but the Senate in particular, insisted on a limit on the amount of tax cut. The 10-year total should not exceed $350 billion. So how was that limit met? Well, by having the key provision, which is an elimination of taxes on dividends. It doesn't take effect immediately. It phases in gradually over 3 years, and then it goes away again. So if you take the literal, if you take the bill literally, you will pay taxes on, you'll pay no taxes on dividends received. I think it's in 2006, but will return to the current tax rate on dividends earned in 2007, which I guess would mean that the incentive for corporations would be to delay all dividends until 2006 and then liquidate themselves at the end of the year. But that actually turns out to be relatively mild compared with the previous tax cut. The 2001 tax cut was also carried out under a ceiling on the size of the tax cut. And that was met, again, by a sunset provision. The whole thing expires in 2011. Among the things that is first gradually phased in and then abruptly returns in 2011 is the estate tax. So that if, according to the law as now written, if your mother dies in 2010 and has a sufficiently large estate, there's an exemption, quite large exemption, but above the exemption, it's a 55% tax rate. If she hangs in there till January 2011, it's 55% tax rate. So that if you take the law as written, it creates a strong incentive for a large number of interesting accidents. Okay, no one thinks any of this is going to happen, right? Everyone, the assumption is that the dividend tax exemption will in fact be made permanent regardless of the state of the budget. Everyone expects that the repeal of the estate tax will in fact be made permanent regardless of the state of the budget. But the striking thing again is the dishonesty of the selling. The bill itself embodies dishonesty. The selling of the bill involves spectacular dishonesty. As I say, there are arguments you could make on behalf of these tax cuts. I obviously don't agree. I think they're actually poor policy. But there are arguments you could make. That's not the way it's been done. And I think that's, in a way, is more important than the content. I can get screamingly upset about the mismanagement of the U.S. economy, but what really striking is really completely different from anything I remember in politics is the fact that there seems to be no discipline requiring that politicians remotely tell the truth about what it is that they're proposing. The mendacity is the message, I guess. That is not something that's uniquely restricted to economics. I don't think I should dwell on it very much, but I think it's becoming quite clear. It already was, but that if we look at the Iraq War, again, there was a case to be made for that war, but not the case that was actually made. That in the United States, it was sold as a blow against al-Qaeda, for which there never was any evidence, and it was sold as a preemptive strike to deal with those huge stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction, which have turned out to be non-existent. And now you could say maybe they just fooled themselves, but the more we know about the process, the more it becomes clear that not just that the whole case was based on cooked intelligence, but it was based on transparently, crudely cooked intelligence. When to take an example, when the alleged uranium purchase documents from Niger were finally passed to the International Atomic Energy Agency, it took them just a few hours to determine that they were crude forgeries, that they just couldn't. They simply had officials in positions that they hadn't held for years. They simply, they bore no resemblance to. It really needed nothing more than Google to find out that these were fraudulent documents, and yet. The claim of purchases of uranium ore from Niger was a central piece of the case for the war. So something funny is going on. As I say, I think the United States is, I think, just to take a step aside and say, we have a general economic problem now. People often talk about deflation. I think that's actually a slightly misleading term. What we really have is a problem of stagnation with deflation as a possible consequence that is becoming increasingly alarming. Essentially, Japan syndrome is popping up all over now. It's popping up in significant parts of Europe. It's popping up in the United States. And we are certainly, each of the major economic powers in its own way is dropping the ball on this one, is failing to deal with it. In the case of Europe, for reasons that you probably know about. In the case of the United States, because of the fixation on Reagan-style tax cuts for high-income people, permanent. The Bush administration is determined to use the economic difficulties, not to solve them. But that, in some ways, is less scary to me, although it's pretty scary, than the change in the way we conduct political debate. And the question, I guess, one I would pose, I have some tentative answers, is why is this happening, or how can it happen? Here we have, this is pretty straightforward. Assessing the distributional impact of a tax cut. Who receives the initial tax cut is not a difficult business. I mean, shouldn't be a controversial business. There are much more controversial things. If you want to ask, what in the end is the incidence? Once you take into account the economic responses, who benefits, who loses, that's something which is a question of analysis and a question of dispute, but simply the question of whose tax forms whose initial tax payments will be reduced by how much as the result of the new law. That's mechanical. You just behind the veil of anonymity, run through the Internal Revenue Service tapes and calculate what a representative sample of people at different incomes would receive. So this should be straightforward. There shouldn't be any controversy about the fact that the 2001 tax cut delivered about 40% of its cuts to the top 1% of the income distribution, which, by the way, means roughly in the United States, roughly families earning more than $350,000 a year. There shouldn't be any controversy about the fact that a elimination of the dividend tax is very much in its direct effect, is very much something that benefits quite wealthy people, partly because stock ownership is highly concentrated, even more so because to the extent that middle-class people in the United States own stocks, they tend to do so through tax-sheltered 401ks, through tax-sheltered accounts, so eliminating the dividend tax doesn't really convey any additional benefit. And yet, it hasn't been possible to get these straightforward things as an acknowledged fact in US political discussion. If you say 40% of the 2001 tax cut goes to the top 1% of the population, you get one of two answers. Well, that's your opinion, or you dirty liberal liar, or Senator Charles Grassley, who was regarded as a moderate in the current constellation, accused people who said that 40% of the tax cut went to the top 1%, which is, as I say, not a controversial issue. It shouldn't be. He accused them of being like Hitler. Give you a sense of where we are in the debate. What's going on? The first thing to say is that in our image of how a democratic society works, you imagine that there is a center, that there are some arbiters who are not associated with either side in the most intense debates, or not closely associated, who get to say, who are regarded as being at least not strongly committed, and you turn to them to pass judgments about what is reality, what is truth. That you go to a nonpartisan research organization and get them to assess who gets the benefits from a tax cut. And that everybody says, yes, well, they're a nonpartisan organization. Or that if a government tries some outrageously misleading representation of its policies, that the center in the legislature, the wise men, say, look, I'm in your party, but this is not true, you can't do that. The important point about the US now is that center doesn't exist. There are no, I wouldn't go so far as to say there are no nonpartisan organizations, as to say that there are no organizations that are given credit for being nonpartisan. That even if you are, basically to say that, well, look, a large share of the president's tax cuts will go to the very, very well off. Whatever you were to start with, you were immediately tagged as being a left-wing hostile organization. That you cannot, in fact, no one is allowed to be nonpartisan in the current climate. The center in Congress doesn't exist anymore. And again, it's partly because you're not allowed to be. There were a couple of swing Republican senators who were disturbed about the size of the latest tax cut, given the deficit problems. Immediately, conservative organizations began running television ads showing those senators with fluttering French flags next to them. So there is, the middle ground is not allowed to exist. You might have expected the news media to play that role of being impartial arbiter. But again, first of all, you're not allowed to be, regardless of how nonpartisan you may actually be. If you are critical, then you are tagged as being an enemy of the administration. And for that matter, the media have become either partisan or extremely, extremely cautious. So roughly speaking, if the U.S. administration proposes a tax cut and it is in fact very much for wealthy people, the certain part of the media, the Fox News, the Washington Times, will say no, it isn't. And the rest of the media will say, well, some Democrats say that it is tilted towards the rich. They will hedge themselves by never actually taking a stand themselves. The only exception would be a couple of op-ed commentators, but that's opinion again. So it doesn't count as nonpartisan. It doesn't count as the center. So that we have an absence of effective check. In other words, the old rules don't apply. You imagine, we all imagine, we want to imagine that when we look at the process by which policies are discussed, economic policies or others, in the United States, the world's greatest power, sophisticated, highly educated, highly sophisticated democracy which has, on the whole, I think, done a pretty good job these past few decades at dealing with its economic problems, that you want to believe that we're having a reasonable debate, that we're actually discussing the issues, that we're actually talking about pros and cons in some way that makes sense. In fact, we're not. In fact, we have positions that are advanced for reasons that may have very little to do with their ostensible goals, and we have no real discussion, no give and take about whether those policies are a good idea. We simply have apologies offered for the policies. We have rationalizations and then strong accusations against anyone who criticizes them. How did that happen? How did we get to that point? And I could make a list. This is not simply, of course, it's not simply tax policy. I did mention the Iraq War, but I think we could also go on and talk about environmental policy. We could talk about corporate reform. There's a whole list of issues in which there is a reasonable debate to be had. The debate is not actually informing our actual policies. How did it happen? Well, certainly a big triggering factor in the United States was September 11th. That has led to, or it's created an environment in which an administration that is so minded, and this one is, can basically use the appeal of patriotism to shut down criticism of all policies, even those that don't apply, don't have any plausible relationship to terrorism itself. And that has happened quite a lot. And again, the example of the French flags being used to condemn people who don't approve of a tax cut. In my mind, I don't see the logical relationship between patriotism and tax cuts, but that doesn't seem to matter. Nonetheless, that has a strong impact on our policy discussions. I think, but that actually turns out not to have been true in previous conflicts. One of the really bizarre things, if you look at U.S. history, is that there was far more effective, far more criticism, far more internal debate during World War II than there is now. It's kind of hard to believe, but it turns out to be true, that there was during World War II, there was free effective criticism. I mean, it's still free, by and large. They haven't sent me to Guantanamo Bay yet. But there was free effective criticism of domestic policies, even in the midst of World War II, to an extent that there is not now. I think there's a deeper story, and it's probably something in which September 11th was an enabling factor rather than a turning point. Which is that we have a powerful right-wing, I don't want to say conservative because it really is radical rather than conservative, but we have a powerful right-wing political movement in the United States that is a kind of coalition of forces that was already very powerful before September 11th, was already very powerful before the 2000 election, but which is now really exerting force on our policy discussion in a way that you didn't see before. And it is kind of an odd coalition if you start to think about it. It includes, obviously, I was about to say people with high incomes, but that may not be fair. One of the odd things about some of these debates has been that policies that outrageously favor the wealthy, the most visible opponents of those policies often turn out to be wealthy people themselves. So that if you want to know who is going out there and campaigning to retain the estate tax, to prevent large-scale transmission of inherited wealth, it's Bill Gates Sr., Bill's father rather than Bill, but that's interesting. If you go and ask who has been campaigning to rein in CEO salaries, to rein in excessive CEO compensation, and you would think, well, it must be Ralph Nader, it must be leftists. It turns out that the most visible figure talking about the outrageous corruption of corporate America is Warren Buffett. So but nonetheless, clearly there are some people who are in there. So one group is people with high incomes, the CEO class. I'm sure if you did a poll, you would discover that the overwhelming majority of America's CEOs are strong supporters of the administration. Another is a policy movement. We often use the phrase neoconservative. You associate it now mostly with foreign policy, but it's a general view of a more aggressive policy abroad and a less intrusive economic policy at home, and also, of course, the religious right in the United States, which is more powerful than I think is widely understood outside and maybe even inside. I'm going to give you an example which came to mind because I brought it up over dinner and people didn't know it, so I think that's interesting. The most powerful man in Congress in the United States is a man named Tom DeLay. Americans not even many Americans are really aware of just his influence. Tom DeLay is, as I say, House Majority Leader, congressman from Texas. It sounds like a snooty intellectual East Coast thing, but in his former career he was an exterminator who went into government because he was upset about the regulations on the poisons he used. The main thing is that he's very much a fundamentalist religious Christian. He says that he went into politics to promote a biblical worldview. What particularly bugs him, after the Columbine school shootings, he held a news conference to explain that this is what happens when you teach high school students the theory of evolution. And remember, we're not talking about some oddball. We certainly have oddball members of the House of Representatives. We are talking about the man who runs the House of Representatives. Okay? There has been an incident. There's a really quite funny story in Texas. And I see I'm getting to where I should wind this down. But there's been a quite funny story in Texas just recently. Texas seems to be the epicenter of a lot of this, but I really don't. So my wife is actually from Texas, so which involved, it's a long story. It was actually quite funny with the Democrats in the state legislature walking out and fleeing to Oklahoma in order to disrupt the proposed redistricting. The interesting parts are, it turns out that the Republicans in the legislature actually got the Department of Homeland Security to trace them down, not to bring them back, thank heavens, but to track them down. But what's interesting is that if you look at what members of the Texas legislature say, there's a fabulous quote that was relayed by Molly Ivins, who's a Texas-based commentator who's been tracking this stuff for much longer than I have, where one member said, where did all these ideas come from? The idea that people are entitled to free medical care, free education, and all of that. It comes from Russia, from the pit of hell. Think about that. Molly Ivins refers to the Texas legislators as Shiite Republicans. The important thing, and this is where I'll leave this part of it, is to say that we are not in normal times. We maintain the rituals. We have G8 meetings, and the U.S. Treasury Secretary is there, and we talk about policies, and we have UN meetings, and we try to settle things up after Iraq, and we act as if, basically the U.S. has a government like the government it had 3 years ago. Something where you can talk with them, you can reason, we can argue about policies. You have earnest editorials, and in newspapers saying perhaps we should reconsider those tax cuts given the state of the budget. We're not in normal times. We're actually in very extreme times. Something very odd is happening in the United States. And to be honest, I don't know how we get out of it. But the important thing to say is that we are in a time when the old rules don't apply, and very drastic things are going to happen in the US one way or another. Let me stop it there.
The other way around, gentlemen, please.
Other way around, all right.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mark Blaise. I'm going to try to get these gentlemen to say a couple of more interesting things. Paul, I don't think you were aware this was the Royal Dutch George Bush fan club you had in front of you. And you don't have bodyguards. Do you have bodyguards at all in America?
No, I'm just very unlisted. I take off this false beard when I need to get away from it.
Listen, I want to start with a couple of. No, let me first start with the rules. Everybody's allowed to ask questions. Just let me know, because the more you participate, the nicer it will become. But let me start with a couple of fast questions with fast answers for Paul, just to get to know you a little better. And the first question is it still nice to be an American citizen today?
Oh, I mean, I want to say this.
Yes.
Right now, for 97% of the people in the United States, maybe not quite that high, things are still fine, right? You know, there's right. I'm still walking around. The tone of conversation is you could still say what you like. There are still you go to the movies, you go to whatever. But I think many people. It's a minority, but many people have got this kind of sick feeling in the pit of their stomach. You feel that something, life is fine, but you have the feeling that something is gaining on you. And in that sense, it's not so nice.
Is America still a democracy?
Yes, but with some, we're at some risk. The media have become. I actually wrote a column about this, I guess, just last week. The U.S. private media are actually far more docile and reluctant to criticize the government than state-owned media in other countries are. And if you don't have really, if you have a self-censoring media, that poses some real threats to your democratic system.
Do you still drink French wine?
Yes. Actually, that's one of those things that didn't work.
Freedom wine.
Freedom wine, indeed. It turns out that, by the way, Tom DeLay, I wonder what kind of name that is. I don't think he's trustworthy. But anyway,
Very French.
But it turns out that actually the one thing Americans won't do is sacrifice anything in terms of consumer goods. French wine sales did a little dip and then went right back up.
One word for patriotism?
A word for patriotism? I don't know what that...
Flag?
Oh, no. Well, I always thought that patriotism meant being willing to sacrifice something for your country.
Would you?
Sure. I think I am a little bit. I'm taking some risks now.
Does Bin Laden exist?
Does what?
Bin Laden exist?
Well, yeah. Look, I mean, there are levels and levels, right? If you want to get how serious a conspiracy theorist are you? And there are people who think that everything was fake and a conspiracy. I don't believe that. I think that what I do think is that the truth is for the most part, the conspiratorial type stuff is not actually hidden. So, for example, if you want to know about what the actual goals of the tax cuts are, you don't go and look for secret meetings. You just read the Heritage Foundation publications, which tell you that they really want to roll back the New Deal, and that's not hidden. It's just sort of not what they say now that they're in public office. If you want, I could go on, but in general, it's not. There's not deep hidden stuff.
Bill Clinton for next president?
I believe, I haven't gone over this with a constitutional lawyer, but I don't believe it's possible.
How about Hillary?
Okay. I have talked with Hillary, and I find her extremely impressive and charming, and I think that makes her completely unelectable.
Sweder, why do you think people want to listen to Paul?
Well, there's an interesting question here. You say that basically you say Osama bin Laden exists and he's president of the United States. It's sort of the fundamentalists have sort of taken over, and the secret agenda is an attack on the welfare state, the New Deal. But in the end, there are going to be elections, and there are well, the benefits of all this are, according to you, very few. There are, how many people that you mentioned were sort of getting 1/4 of the tax cut? Just a few. How many votes is that? And how many people profit from Medicare? So how come that this group can actually win elections if they alienate a lot of people and benefit a few?
Well, I mean, the 2002 election was the midterm election. Congressional elections were interesting. In the summer of 2002, polls indicated that it was likely to be a blowout in favor of the Democrats. The economy was stumbling, the corporate scandals, and if people had voted as they suggested they would vote in July of 2002, we would have had an enlarged Democratic majority in the Senate. The Democrats would have taken over the House. We would be in divided government now. Yeah. Then came the agitation for the Iraq War. And I think that what happened in the 2000 election in the United States was that George Bush ran as a moderate. And what happened between then and 2002 was September 11th. And the belief that that this party is the party of national security has trumped a lot of other stuff. I mean, if there are, your language and mine, if you look at regression models of electoral outcomes, they actually suggested that Gore should have won in 2000. And by a large enough margin so that hanging chads couldn't swing it. And if
he did win, didn't he?
Yeah, well, and if you look at at 2002, it should have been a Democratic blowout, and a lot of it is. I mean, I think there are other factors as well, but a lot of it, certainly the national security thing has made it possible, has changed politics in a way that's very hard. Changes the rules. What's funny about it is that if you really ask, well, what is the Bush administration doing that on national security that any administration wouldn't do? You find it hard to answer that, but nonetheless, it certainly changes the dynamics.
So Margaret Thatcher got 4 extra years out of the Falklands afterglow, and then was kicked out, and we got after an intermission, an intermediary person. We ended up with Tony Blair, and the common sense took over again. How do you see the future of the US? Is it sort of, are they fundamentally off the rails, and are we going to see a very unstable superpower with sort of partial interest running the show, or is common sense going to come back after sort of the next round?
The answer is I wish I knew. I mean, you can tell the story either way. And this is really, of course, stuff I don't have expertise in. What I really know, I can look at the economic policies, I can look at the reality, and look at the gap. It's 2 stories. One story is that something like what happened to George Bush Sr. happens. That people look at a weak economy, they've really changed their focus away from national security. And at that point, there's a real, and whatever outrages people were motivated by in 1992 are much worse now. The other story is that we continue to have this process. A lot has to do with what happens. I think a lot has to do with or a lot of the uncertainty I have has to do with media and the way things are portrayed.
Is there a difference between American and European media when it comes to honesty?
Well, I can't speak for European. I mean, what is true is that a lot of people, the tiny number of Americans who read British media, who got their news from the BBC or reading British papers online, has surged. There's a broad feeling among a certain class of people that you can't trust what you see in the U.S. This is different. I mean, we have this. If you contrast the BBC with an American television network, the BBC is a quango, quasi-non-governmental organization. That is, it's really a public organization, but set up to be independent. But people, it clearly could be tempted to be an arm of the government, and because everybody knows that, it bends over backward not to be. A U.S. television network is a quasi-private organization. It appears to be a private company, but in all cases now, they're all parts of large conglomerates, which do a lot of business with the government, and clearly is tempted to say, to be good to the people in power, and is much less subject to sanctions. There's much less oversight because that's more implicit. So I think actually the U.S. has moved to the press.
Do you think deals have been made between the press and the government? Let's say about Iraq. Let's talk about Iraq because it's really interesting. Do you think the media have been used by the government to deceive us all?
I think we want to be a little careful here. Did Colin Powell know that what he said to the UN wasn't true? The answer is he must have had some suspicions, but I think there's a lot of wishful thinking involved. Were the U.S. media unwilling to raise questions about what was going on? Yes. You can even document it. You can even find stories that were pulled. And it wasn't. I don't believe that there are guys sitting in rooms twirling their mustaches and saying, "Ha ha, we're going to fool the American public." I think there's a general sense that just a general sense of going along.
Is this a fear of conservative backlash, or sort of the National Rifle Association coming after you, or whatever?
It's a fear
of intimidation.
It's low-key intimidation. It's business opportunities. Think about the fact. I guess I'm losing it now, but
let's put it this way. Remember the first Gulf War, where the daughter of the I think Kuwaiti ambassador in Washington was kidnapped, and a big story. And then we found out it was all used to convince the American public to support the war. Now we have the story about Jessica something, who was liberated. What's true about this?
Well, we, again, the BBC has run us. This is the sequence seen around the world of the liberation of Private Jessica Lynch from the hospital, which really looked like a made-for-TV movie, and apparently was. That it was. There are some disputes about details, but it seems clear that there were no guards. That the doctors in the hospital had attempted to return her to the Americans the day before. The only dispute is whether. As far as I think it's trivial, is whether the American soldiers were actually firing blanks or whether they were firing real bullets, but at nobody in particular. And the thing is, the BBC has got more details, but we actually had some of the story in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. It has not appeared on TV in the U.S. I think we can say it won't. And it's not so much, we're going to lie to the public as, well, the public isn't ready to hear that, and it would maybe be unpatriotic, and we'll get mail. You should see my mail.
I have a question here.
What?
Yeah, sorry, that's what I wanted to ask a little bit. What I don't understand is, why is the American media so docile? I mean, it can be all because of 11 September. I mean, who forces them to do so? What compels them to be docile?
Okay. We're not talking a lot about economics, but I'm sorry. That's the way, it's just what we have to talk about now. The couple of pressures. I mean, I see some of it. Partly it's commercial. Right? It's NBC is ultimately owned by General Electric, which is also a major defense contractor. Think about that. There's and then at the level of the individual journalist, we have a scandal machine in the U.S. There's a set of institutions that go out and try to dig up dirt and circulate anything that looks like dirt, and it was turned against the Clintons all through the Clinton years. Bear in mind, we had a $70 million investigation of a failed land deal in Arkansas that created a constant feeling that there was something scandalous, and nothing was ever found. That same machinery is now turned against anyone who raises questions about the administration. I felt a bit of it myself personally, so it's not nice. And most people, most journalists want to get on with their lives, have their careers. They don't want to deal with that.
So it's McCarthyism again.
It's more subtle than McCarthyism, and that's the thing. Everything is more subtle now.
Witch hunt.
Yeah.
Sweder, can you speak into the microphone,
Yeah.
please?
I was just asking whether McCarthy had come back from the 50s.
I'm aware that you'd rather speak about economics, but this is a subject I think everybody finds very interesting. There's another question here.
Mr. Krugman, two questions actually, and they're interrelated. The likelihood of the passage of Patriot Act 2, something that affects a lot of people living abroad, and with the retirement of several justices of the Supreme Court possibly pending, and a further swing to the right of the court system, how does that impact both economic policy and global policy?
The answer to both those is I don't know. I haven't. For those who don't know, Patriot Act 2 is an even more extreme version of Patriot Act 1, which is what we have been under since shortly after September 11th. Initially, the Justice Department denied that it existed. Now it says, oh, well, yes, it's there, but it's only a draft, and I don't know what's going to happen. And about Supreme Court justices, again, I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, we do have a situation now where it's going to be, to use the technical term, it's going to be hell on wheels, I think, because I think on this, if it follows the pattern of what's been happening at lower level judicial appointments, the White House will try to put up people who are very, very conservative, and the Democrats will at least try to filibuster, and it's going to be, it's going to be awesome. I mean, if you want, I'm reading a lot of French Third Republic history these days. And it's the feeling in this stuff feels to me more like, we're kind of, just a general feeling in the country, polarization is, think Dreyfus affair. That's the kind of state we're in right now.
There's another question here.
Yeah, of course, it's very interesting that you are talking more about politics than about economics. You've talked mostly about the culture of deception and the reality gap in the case of the taxes and so forth. And I was actually surprised that you have not talked about Karl Rove, who some have said obviously he's not the big man behind Bush who invents all the policy, but definitely is the one that puts it together and is able to bridge political considerations with the coalition, the right-wing coalition. And I'm not very well versed in all the tax details that you were just mentioning, but I was struck by your dates of 2007 and 2011. Does that have anything to do with the political cycles of re-elections, 2008 and 2012?
I think in terms of I think that the stuff with the tax and it is not really time for the election cycle. It was time to they pushed it as far back as they could while keeping within the cap. I don't think it's not clear to me whether this the big tax fight coming just before the presidential election is a plus or a minus for the Republicans. What can I say? I actually don't think that they have a time map strategy out beyond the 2004 election. I think the basic point is that all real problems are postponed until after the 2004 election, and beyond that. Let me say, I'm enough of an economist still, believer in invisible hand and all that I actually think that the individuals are less important than we might think. I try in my mind to say. what would have happened without the butterfly ballots in Florida. Suppose George Bush hadn't become president. I think actually President Gore facing the terrorism environment would have faced absolute hell. He would have been under furious criticism for doing exactly the same things. We would just have postponed this denouement one election cycle. I think that if Karl Rove wasn't there, they would nonetheless have found some brilliant, cynical political operator to run behind this. There were other Karl Roves out there. That this is something that was lurking in American society, waiting to happen. Maybe it was delayed 8 years by the personal charisma of Bill Clinton. But this is something that was coming and something we have to get through.
But Karl Rove had a very sad youth, and I don't think there are many as powerful people in the U.S. today as Mr. Rove. There's another question here.
Hello. We had on Dutch TV recently a program on the Carlyle Group.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you'd like to talk about your ideas about how that story could get out in the U.S. because it's out over here, but we don't think that nobody wants to touch it in the U.S. What do you think about that?
Okay, if people don't know, the Carlyle Group is a defense. It's sort of crony capitalism made official. It's a group that does deals always involving the government somehow, hires former government officials, including George Bush Sr., the recently retired CEO was Donald Rumsfeld's wrestling partner in college. Give you an idea of how, and of course there's some of that always. That's the old principle. At the highest levels, everybody was a roommate in college. But this is really, it's quite extreme. And the best story, if you really want to start having getting crazy, is the Carlyle Group was holding a meeting on September 11, 2001, where in attendance was James Baker, the Bush family consigliere, I guess you'd say, and the other people in attendance were several members of the Bin Laden family who were at that point investors in the group. So but I mean it's I've tried, and to a large extent, I'm in correspondence with Dan Briety, who's written a good book about Carlyle. And I've been trying to figure out what to say and when to say it, because to some extent it's just people don't want to hear. And it falls, it just falls, a tree falls in the forest, etc. It's just very difficult. And it's one of these things that you're always struggling with. I mean, there are a lot. I mean, Carlyle is not unique. A lot of sweet contracts in Iraq for Halliburton. So it's pretty amazing stuff.
Yeah, we've seen corruption in government here too. But let me bring it back to economics a little bit. Some of the one of the ways in which what happens in the US spills over to the rest of the world is trade policy. And here the administration has been giving off sort of mixed signals. They've been very protectionist on trades, on agriculture, steel. On the other hand, they push a very liberal agenda in the multilateral trade talks. What can we expect, what can Europeans expect from US trade policy?
Okay. Yeah, thanks for bringing it back, because I think we should talk about these things. Okay. Now here's a case where traditionally on trade, the U.S. has been not 100%, but the U.S. has been the good guy. Compared with the EU, the U.S. has been definitely the good guy, and that's been across administrations. So you really find a lot of pro free trade policies and continuation of policies. So you have a lot of stuff that was begun under Bush 1 being brought to, or under Reagan being brought to fruition under Clinton. What you have right now is an ambitious agenda for trade liberalization, but very remarkably little willingness to implement. And I think I think Zellick, the trade representative, is sincere and a big free trader. And the trouble is that the political arm, when faced with a choice between principles and a special interest group, is, I won't say always there, but is much more likely than in previous administrations to give the special interest group what it wants. And that means that the U.S. Does say one thing and does another. And I don't know, I've been, Doha looks to me like, all right, I'm going to give a qualification. On the basis of current evidence, I would say that Doha looks like it's headed for collapse.
Yeah.
Now, the thing that
But
gives me...
partially because of Europe. This is the...
Yeah,
this
right.
is for the
Doha is the current round of trade negotiations. Yeah. Now, the thing to say is that in 1990, the Uruguay round, which was the previous round, also appeared to be on the verge of collapse. And through heroic efforts by Bush 1 and then Clinton, and also through some conciliation on the part of Europe, it was brought back from the brink. And I guess the question is have things worsened so much that that won't happen now? But right, everybody. The Europeans are still the worst players on this, okay? Let me be an ugly American just a minute here. European agricultural protectionism is still the biggest stumbling block to any progress. And if any hopes, we might have hoped that with the U.S. kind of losing its way, that the Europeans would step into the breach, and they have not. And the Americans are losing their way. With everything from intellectual property to steel to it's just so it's a mess. And
well, the French blocked reform of the cap till 2013 or whatever it is, far in the future. Now, some people think that sort of in the 30s the world was pushed over the edge by what was this act called? But protectionist trade policy. Do we run that risk again?
Not for that reason. Okay, let me talk economics for a minute here. I don't buy that about the 30s. I mean, protectionism makes the world less efficient, but when you're talking about depression, efficiency is not the issue. We're really talking about inadequate demand. And I don't think that we're going to do that. I don't think that protectionism makes a big difference one way or the other. You can tell some stories, but it's not...
It's shifting from one place to another.
And if everybody does it, it really just sort of bottles it up within the countries, but it doesn't really change the overall very much, right? If we restrict trade, that reduces your exports, but it also reduces my imports, and so the overall effect on world demand is approximately zero. What did happen in the 30s was that everybody failed to sustain demand, and that the risk of something. Well, Japan is the first 1930s economy to reappear in slow motion, minor key, in the 90s, and I've got obsessed with Japan about 5 years ago, trying to figure out how this could happen. And now, at this point, you do have to say that both the United States and a good part of Europe are looking similar.
Germany,
yes. Germany's got a double burden. It's got an overvalued exchange rate within the EU, within EMU, and which you can't do anything about now that you have one money.
It's nice to see you so relaxed, but there are so many questions. I really have to interrupt you for a moment.
Okay, sorry.
Gentleman here first.
Yeah, I'm sorry to bring you back to politics.
I knew it.
But I was wondering, America is always a country of extremes when you compare it with Europe. And we have had extreme movements before. McCarthy was mentioned. Of course, we had an affair with President Nixon. We had George Wallace, who in European eyes was a very extreme man. But somehow or other, American society has, although the swings further out, has always brought all these trends back again. And I wondered whether the same was in European going to happen with Bush and Rumsfeld and Cheney and those guys. And if it happens, will they fall as deeply as Nixon did?
The answer is I have no idea, right? I mean, this is just the answer. We have no idea. I mean, my faith is the United States has always pulled itself back, and we've gotten through all of these terrible crises. What gives me pause is if you look at the way that the McCarthy era came to an end at the fall of Joseph McCarthy, it involved basically the establishment saying, enough, this is no good. And there's a famous scene in which Joseph Welch says, "Have you at long last, sir, no sense of decency?" There are no Joseph Welches in America today. We don't have an establishment. There is no one, there is no group of people who everyone accepts as the voice of the American center, as the national conscience. So it's hard to imagine it. Nonetheless, I mean, one hopes, and this is, you do what you can and hope for the turn. And yeah, look, people in the intelligence community, I always love that phrase. But anyway, people who know something about this say that the whole business about the Iraq War is much worse than Iran-Contra. And they think that if it's ever brought to a head, that there are going to be people going to jail. So this could be very, very severe. In another time, in another context, if you said there would be things that could be considered impeachable offenses in there. It's not going to happen, but there may be a time when we look back at this and say, "My God, how could we have gone down that path?"
One more question here.
Yes, basically I have two small questions. Do you think that the transatlantic rift, the political rift, will have a backlash, will have economic consequences for Europe? And I'm hinting at, for example, at the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. There is this feeling among also lots of economic players over here in Europe, in several countries, that the US wants to set the rules in all kinds of areas.
Yeah.
That's the first question.
Yeah.
And then the second question is, I'm very curious what your idea is about Europe after the enlargement. How do you judge this continent?
On the second one, I'm going to punt because I really don't. I'm going to pass because I don't think I know enough. I just don't know enough. I just haven't done the homework. On the first one, let me give you a funny. I've spent a while recently poring over the U.S. balance of payments. Funny things that economists do for fun, and the question was, if the U.S. of course runs this huge current account deficit financed by capital inflows, and in the late 90s, the capital inflows were primarily private investment flows into the U.S., and which went to a lot of direct investment, Daimler buying Chrysler and so on, and also purchases of stocks. Those have dried up drastically, and the question is what's taken its place? And it's actually a two-part answer. One part of it I knew about, which was that Asian central banks are buying a lot of dollar reserves, or were until a few weeks ago. The other thing that's a little surprising, and believe it or not, this is an answer to your question, is that as European investment in the United States has dropped off sharply, or foreign investment, I think it's largely European, U.S. investment abroad has also dropped off sharply. So if you actually look at the capital flows, it's almost as if the capital markets are very early warning sign of a world dividing, of a separation. I wouldn't be surprised. If I take all these things together, I wouldn't be surprised to see that we will be looking 10 years from now at a world in which there's a lot less business interaction across the Atlantic. Now that's not necessarily catastrophic. Again, it reduces efficiency, but that may not be the most important thing. But I would not be surprised at all to see that there's going to be a lot of that the Atlantic is going to get a lot wider. And then, of course, the British will have to decide which side of it they're on.
There's so many questions from the public. I have one more question to bring it back to the economics. For both of you, I would be interested to know whether tax cuts per se will create new jobs, as Mr. Bush is promising.
Oh gosh, yeah, some. I mean, here's the arithmetic. Okay, the tax cut bill, as it emerges, will probably push something like, let's say, $60 billion into the U.S. economy over the next year. Of that, maybe half will be spent, which means that we're talking about a fiscal stimulus of 0.4% of U.S. GDP, which might add several 100,000 jobs to what we would otherwise have. Maybe 500,000 to what we would otherwise have.
But it will cost about $55 billion to create them.
No, it cost about $700 billion to create them because it's a 10-year.
So why not just divide $700 billion through 1 million
I've done that.
The money?
That's no, it's incredibly inefficient.
I know. I'm not an economist.
We could simply hire 1 million workers for much less than this. We could hire 5 million workers. The important thing I was going to make is that if you actually look at where we are right now compared to where we should be, we have a shortfall in the U.S. of between 4 and 5 million jobs. So these tax cuts are they're extremely expensive, but because they're so inefficient, the actual job creation is wildly small. It's a drop in the bucket compared with the problem.
But in a way, it's odd that people get so worked up about them. I think you're right that they're sort of misdirected and they put money in pockets of people who are obviously not liquidity and not constrained. If they want to spend more, they can, and the tax cut won't make any difference. But they're actually relatively small. 60 billion sounds like a big number, but the arithmetic you went through is actually the way you should look at it. It's very small. The 50 is a lot, but the US is even bigger. It's a smallish tax cut. It's not very well timed, but it won't do much good, won't do much bad either. It's largely inconsequential.
Well, except if you take the Bush tax cuts as a group,
it's a percentage of GDP.
No, 2001 plus the 2003, it ends up being around 2.5% of GDP in total, which is fairly significant.
Which is roughly what we are talking about now, sort of our government wants to do as part of their new program. It's not earth-shattering. It won't change the course of history. It's not putting the U.S. into bankruptcy. It's not very smart policy.
It's accelerating.
But does it matter?
It's accelerating our move. No, actually, I mean, I guess there's always a question of context. Sorry, too much here. But it turns out that we talk a lot about the fiscal crisis of long-run fiscal crisis, very long-run of Social Security and Medicare in the U.S. Yes. Turns out that the tax cuts are more than enough. The resources involved are more than enough to secure Social Security and Medicare through the year 2075. So on the one hand, you can say, well, it's not all that big. Yeah, I mean, the United States, barring other things, the United States, we have the lowest tax rate among major advanced countries. We take the total tax, all levels of government, is under 30% of GDP. No. Canada is 40% of GDP. No. So if the U.S. went up to Canadian levels of taxation, it could pay off all of this stuff. Right. So it's more, but it's not going to happen. But yeah, I mean, if we get ourselves another Franklin Roosevelt, he can put it all right, or she can put it all right. But that's the question: is will we?
There's a question here about tax cuts.
Yes, you analyzed the tax cut bill in terms of a policy of deception. You said that the government was misleading the citizenry about who was getting what. Well, I'm not really convinced by this. Those figures about 40% of the tax cut going to 1%, those got spread around a lot. It was voiced on the floor of Congress. It was in the newspapers. It was even on CNN. And I'm sure you're right when you say that Bush was deliberately trying to mislead the public, but I think the public understood what was going on. And I think that what's behind it at a deeper level is not so much a policy of deception as a culture of self-deception. When Americans were asked whether they think they belong in the top 1%, 17% said they thought they were in that top 1%, and another third said that they thought in their lifetime they were going to enter it. These people think that bill is for them.
Yes.
And
Well,
I think also there was another wonderful figure. In Britain and in the US, it was asked, how are you prepared to pay more tax for better public services? In Britain, 60% of the people asked were willing to pay more. In America, it was 1%. So there is a really serious problem of self-deception, and it's fed into by full capitalism in America, where everybody's been playing the stock market since the 1960s. It's a kind of culture and economy of the casino. So do something about that.
well, let me say there were. I mean, obviously, yes, we all love that poll, and it is interesting, and it's this Lake Wobegon economy where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average. But which is, by the way, how CEO salaries get so high. Each year, the compensation committee takes a representative group of other CEOs and say, well, our guy's so good, he needs to be paid 20% above the average. What can I say? I always now try to talk about people earning more than $350,000 a year rather than top 1%, because people then have some sense, and a lot of it is just that people don't know. I don't believe that poll about public services. I haven't seen that one, but I think But also, a lot of this comes out of relentless propagandizing. The important thing, the estate tax. There has been a campaign over a period of more than a decade to convince people that the estate tax is a burden on you. And so if you go to a room and ask how many of you think you're going to pay estate tax, go to a room of older Americans, ask how many of you think you're going to pay estate tax, about half of them a random sample will say, my estate will pay taxes. And what we know is, in fact, only 2% of estates ever pay any estate tax, and it's trivial for all but a fraction of that. But that misconception didn't arise out of thin air. That's the result of a relentless propaganda campaign. I understand that there's a campaign that's being prepared against Tom Daschle, which shows regular folks attacking Tom Daschle, this Senate Minority Leader, showing a barber saying, well, Tom Daschle is opposed to the repeal of the estate tax, and what's going to happen to my estate when I die? And that must be some barber. The exemption for a U.S. couple is $1.3 million.
Expensive haircuts.
You said something about salaries. That's an interesting point here in this country.
Yes.
We think that we quite often think that high salaries for bad jobs are not very fair. How about the situation in America? Because that's the example for the salaries here.
Well, yes. Well, we've gone wild. This is a tremendous failure of corporate governance. Top 100 CEOs, average compensation. A lot of it comes in the form of options. Average compensation was about 40 times that of the average employee in the 70s, which seemed like a lot. It's 1,000 to 1 now. It's the average among the top 100 CEOs is around $35 to $40 million a year now, and there's no indication that you need. First of all, there's no indication that that's linked to performance at all. There's no indication that you need that to get good people. Actually, my favorite creativity and pay. What's the best single piece of logo design? This is a little bit funny. The best single piece of logo design that we've seen in the last couple of decades, and it's clearly the euro symbol, which was done by some guy working at the European Commission, just scribbling on a pad. But you can imagine, if an advertising agency had been hired to do that, it would have received the CEO would have received $30 million. And anyway, so no, we've gone mad, and it is the thing is, it sets a tone. Can I say that you get a society where basically everybody who has insider advantage feels able to exploit it to the max. That's what has happened in the U.S. And if Europe can can, I can be as much of an ugly American as anybody, talking about German labor law and so on, but you do not need to pay CEOs $30 million.
But what do you do about it? Because the European Commission now is sort of working on all kind of proposals to improve corporate governance. And they say the same thing you say. Look, it's a failure of corporate governance, the way shareholders keeping CEOs honest. Well, they can't do that. But what the European Commission is doing is trying to give the shareholders more power on these things. Well, that's what they have in the US, and look at what's happening there.
But it's not true, actually. And the U.S. Well, this is a long story. We'll probably keep people here too long. But the point is that the shareholders are not actually empowered. That in the U.S. system, they get no independent ability to do this. And the decentralized ownership of U.S. corporations is really what makes it possible.
Sweder, what do you tell your boards, sitting on several boards yourself, when it comes to money?
Well, basically the thing that Paul is saying. Nobody has been bought away to a US bank. I don't think the argument of international competition, sort of forcing high salaries in Dutch boardrooms, holds any sway at all. And it's poisoning labor relations.
But you tell them stop, or you tell them go on?
Yes, I think that the trends that are going on now are damaging, are seriously damaging, but I don't think we know how to stop it. You say that shareholders have no power in the US. Well, they certainly have more power than they have in Holland, where they have no power at all because they're blocked from exercising any power. We have a particular corporate governance regime that's designed to sort of eliminate shareholder power.
Should we take America as the example for better corporate governance,
well, it doesn't help,
for morale?
It doesn't help because the discrepancy between top salary and average salary is much larger in the US than it is here. So we actually don't, through mechanisms of corporate governance, we can't put a brake on this.
Paul, do you think
we haven't found a way of doing that?
America is the example for European business morale?
No, I mean, we all have our problems. I mean, I think that what we now see is I'm not sure I know what the answers are, but I think we're a couple of years past the point where Americans could say, look, we've solved the problem. I mean, if there's one thing if there's one remark in his lifetime, well, one of two, that Larry Summers is going to be really ashamed of, it's going to be the one where he said that American accounting principles are the basis of our supremacy.
What's the other remark you like of Larry's?
Oh, a little bit about pollution, but we don't want to get into that one.
There's a long-waiting question there.
Could you say a little bit more about the similarities between the economic situation in Japan in the late 80s and the current situation in America and Western Europe?
Yeah, the nightmare scenario is when the central bank loses traction. When you get into a situation where the economy is depressed and the central bank, having done all that it can, still isn't able to turn it around. And then you worry that this can become gradually a self-reinforcing process because modest inflation gives way to deflation, which makes people less willing to spend, less willing to borrow, which leads to a deeper, a larger output gap, which leads to more deflation. That's the Japanese scenario. The United States, the Fed funds rate, the interest rate the Fed controls directly, is currently at 1.25%, having come down from 6.5%. And the economy is still losing jobs. The Fed believes its technical minimum is 0.75, actually, that below that you start to have problems with the plumbing of the economy. The mutual fund industry starts to disintegrate. So effectively, it's got only half point of interest. It's got essentially nothing left. The Fed has run out of ammunition. The economy is still sluggish. We're hoping that it will turn up spontaneously, but that's very iffy. If it doesn't, then we're in Japan territory. The ECB has more room to cut, but it's questionable, and the European economy actually looks even more sluggish than the U.S. economy, and same problems, and of course, actual deflation looming in Germany, so we're all looking kind of Japanese right now. We're hoping that That what we're actually, at this point in the United States, we are counting upon the people saying, well, we're only operating at 70% of capacity, but gee, those new machines look awfully nifty. Let's go out and invest. And that's possible, but that's a hope, not a policy.
Sir?
Yep. Question, weak dollar, good, bad, and for how long?
Good for us, bad for the Europeans. It's amazing. It's unfair, but it's for the U.S. it's helpful. That's a more effective stimulus than anything we're doing through policy. For the Europeans, it's a negative. But the thing to say, I think, is that neither economy is that open, right? The U.S. Has external trade. Both the U.S. and the European Union have external trade of a little over 10% of gross domestic product. So even a fairly large currency movement does something at the margin. It's not that big a deal. Personally, I'm very upset. We're taking a European vacation and did not lock it in. But it's, and as for, interesting, the U.S. is running an enormous current account deficit, and even relative to the size of its economy. So this was going to happen sooner or later. And I've been predicting it any day now for the past 2 years. So in some sense, I'm a little gratified that it's finally happening.
Don't give
Nicky
up.
Caldo once said that economists are very good at predicting what is going to happen, but very bad at predicting when it will happen.
Yes.
And that's really the
And there's
trick.
Herbert Stein's law.
There's a question here.
Yeah.
Sorry, first one quick follow-up question on Japan, where you keep talking about the Japan impact and comparison between the US and German situations in Japan. Does that mean to say that you're as pessimistic about the economic fundamentals, which might mean that we'd be in that slump for as long? Second quick question, just to return to politics for one moment. You talked just a question of cause and effect, saying that 9/11 was more an enabler than actually a cause, and that one of the main, let's say, motors behind what's happening was the rise of the far right. My question would be then, why this rise of the far right?
Okay. Let me do the economics first. I do believe that the United States and some other countries have an inherent advantage, not so much from what we usually think of as economic fundamentals, but from demography. It's just one of the really hard. It's very hard to get people investing when your working age population is shrinking steadily. And of course, that, as you know, applies to a lot of continental Europe as well. So, and it does not apply to the United States. So we actually have that advantage, which is why I think that the U.S. is probably not heading for a Japanese-style decade of stagnation. But I'm not dead sure, and Europe ought to be very concerned. Frankly, I could have turned this evening into a tirade about the ECB, but this is, after all, the John Adams event, so it shouldn't be. I don't really, just to say about the U.S. right, I think that the political scientists who I actually now talk to across department lines at Princeton, they think that the rise in income inequality has a lot to do with the political polarization. I think that's probably true. I think there's other stuff going on. There's something about social anxieties. There's something about the rise of fundamentalist religious feelings. I don't understand where that comes from. Pure amateur speculation, but it's clear that there's the deep causes, and why is the United States so different? There's a very, very good paper by Smeating on income distribution called "Why Are We So Different About the U.S. in a Comparative Perspective," and I think that's a broader thing. Why something is very different, and something is going on, and if you see my mail, I don't actually want to wish that on anybody, but there is a level of anger in the U.S. that seems odd, considering how good things have been for many people. But there is something going on.
Maybe we unfortunately have to wrap up this discussion, a very interesting discussion, with the last question for both of you. Would you say that the eagle has landed? And if so, where? In the shade? In the sun? Maybe Sweder.
Eagle has landed. Does this mean it's sort of not flying anymore and we see the end of the US miracle? No, I don't think so. If you sort of look at Japan, look at Europe is Germany, and let's be honest, we are a province of Germany. So it's Japan, Germany, and the US. Then I would still be much more optimistic about the US than about either one of the other two. Japan has a huge aging problem, coming much earlier, a political class incapable of deciding anything except fighting over bribes. Germany is sort of turning itself into Japan. We are in trouble. The US has sort of a bad president and a vociferous right, but somehow I have a belief in the pendulum story that somebody brought up before. Somehow the US population seems to come to its senses. I still think that that will come back, and then the basic U.S. economy is not in as much trouble as ours is. So no, the eagle hasn't landed in the sense that sort of the U.S. is in for trouble.
Paul?
I'd agree with Sweder that actually, if you look at the economies of the big three, that the U.S. probably has the most. The best prospects. We're making a bad job of good prospects, but we still have the best prospects. And if you, I think the world as a whole is in a strangely difficult situation. What is so disturbing about it is that we actually ought to be in much better shape than we are, and the difference. Yeah, I mean. In objective terms, the U.S. is still holding the best position. In terms of the deterioration from where things seemed to be 3 years ago, the United States has suffered the biggest fall, but that still leaves us far ahead of the game. I guess the real question I have about the U.S. is I don't know who we are anymore. I think we may not be the same people we were, and we're finding out who we are now, and I'm not sure I want to know the answer.
Sweder, you've been in government, so I'm sure you will agree. Paul Krugman for president. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you.